homeschooling kids with ADHD. This is going to be a longer video because I want to explain to you why my position on this topic has evolved. And I also want to talk about some of the issues I've seen, as well as things to consider before homeschooling your child with ADHD. So, the reason I used to be opposed to homeschooling kids with ADHD was for several reasons. Number one, I had several boys who attended my school year programs or summer camp who were homeschooled, and I found that they could not tolerate being around a group of similar age boys for an extended period of time. And when I say extended period of time, I mean like 2 hours. And they would go home and tell their parents those other kids were annoying. Now, granted, that's not an unusual thing for kids with ADHD to do when they're uncomfortable in new situations, but this happened with every kid I met who was homeschooled who attended my programs. The second reason that I was opposed to homeschooling previously was because I worked with several boys who were previously in brick and mortar schools and then were homeschooled, and they became physically aggressive towards their mothers, the person who was homeschooling them, and they had no history of physical aggression before that. When they went back into public school or wherever, then the physical aggression stopped. Here's why my position about homeschooling kids with ADHD has evolved. Number one, the research data shows that kids who are homeschooled turn out just fine. They don't turn out any differently than kids who are not homeschooled. Number two, I've always had the saying school was not designed for boys. School was definitely not designed for boys with ADHD. Unfortunately, educators get very little training and education in ADHD, and I don't see any change to that in the near future. All the time I have parents ask me, "Can you do a training, at our in our school district?" And what I always tell them is, your school district is not going to be interested in the training in ADHD, and 99.9% of the time I've been right about that. I'm a strong supporter of public schools. I've worked at public schools. I went through public schools. However, I just don't see things changing for the better in the near future. Here's a common problem I see in families of kids with ADHD when they're considering homeschooling. They often do it out of emotional reactivity. Recently, a family reached out to me, and for the past 3 years, they've been pulling their son out of school towards the end of each school year. And I asked them, "Why are you doing that?" And they said, "Well, he just tends to fall apart academically." And I said, "Who advised you to pull him out and homeschool him for the last portion of the school year?" And they said, "Nobody." When the choice to homeschool is done as a result of emotional reactivity, that's not the way to make an informed decision about something. Sometimes I've had parents say, "My son is struggling socially, so I'm thinking about homeschooling him because I don't want this to affect his self esteem." And what I explain to them is protecting his feelings is not going to help his self esteem. Again, that is a decision made out of emotional reactivity of wanting to protect their child's feelings, and that is not a reason to homeschool. Here are my recommendations if you're considering homeschooling. Number one, this has to be an extremely thoughtful decision, not based in emotional reactivity. You need to talk to people who are familiar with homeschooling so you can hear the pros and cons. I strongly suggest you reach out to somebody like my colleague Tava from Rebel Parents on Instagram, who supports parents who are homeschooling or unschooling. Number two, ask for your child's feedback and see what they say. Sometimes I found that kids are extremely opposed to it. They don't want to leave their friends at school. And sometimes I found that kids are fine with it. Number three, and this is probably the most difficult question you have to ask yourself, do you have the skill set to be able to teach? Lots of people homeschool who do not really have the ability to teach. And we could make the argument that that's no big deal. Kids still learn anyway. But I think if you are lacking the skill set to be able to teach, or if your child has some challenges with learning differences or with reading, those kind of things, you need to get them support rather than you trying to figure this out by yourself. My last suggestion, and this one is really important to me, if you choose to homeschool, I think that your child should have interaction with similar age peers at least 4 days a week. There are a lot of homeschooling co ops out there, there are unschooling groups, there are a lot of ways to do this, and there's not one way that homeschooling or unschooling has to look, but it's critically important that your child has regular interaction with similar age peers and they're not just sitting at home with you all day. If you have experience with homeschooling you'd like to share, please feel free to share it here because it would be helpful for other families to hear it, both the pros and cons in your experience. I look forward to hearing from you.